Mike has outlived so many newspapers. He keeps drawing and drawing and drawing, drawing his own conclusions, his own philosophies. He must have had a driving ambition. You don't get there and you don't stay there unless you want it very, very deeply.
Welcome to Meatbone Express, the filmmaking podcast. Today on the program is Luke Oldman, film composer of such films as Fell and the Leunig Fragments, the new controversial documentary about cartoonist Michael Lunik. Welcome to the program, Luke.
Hi, Mike.
Firstly, explain how you became a composer for film. My understanding is someone tracked you down.
Well, yeah, I guess so. Although at the same time, probably the first experience that set me off in the direction of composing was a film experience anyway. Although I didn't start off writing for film, it was when, as a teenager, I was watching a VHS from the local video shop of 2001: A Space Odyssey for the first time, and just being completely knocked out by the score, which so prominently features contemporary classical music by George Ligeti, the great Hungarian composer. In particular, the Requiem from the Kyrie part of his Requiem. I just thought these sounds were impossible. I'd never heard anything like it, and I was delighted and astonished to find out that these were just human sounds. It sounded alien, but it was all traditional classical music, just in a way I'd never heard it before, for voice and orchestra. Beautiful music, and anyone who's seen the film knows what I'm talking about. It's pretty iconic. So from that point, I knew that I wanted to compose. Why or what for, I had no idea as a teenager, but I found my way. I did music at university. I wasn't going to be doing anything else at university, and studied composition, and never really had thought about composing for film. I was writing music for small social gatherings of like-minded people, and I still do. Chamber music for piano, strings, small numbers of instrumentalists. But a friend of a friend of a friend had heard that I was writing music, and my friend asked me to send some music in for consideration, for the consideration of a director. And that was Casimir Burgess, the director of Fell, and I didn't take it seriously. I thought, well, this is crazy. No one's going to be asking me for film music. I just write chamber music, and I was extremely lax. And it was only on the third request of my friend that I decided finally, okay, I guess I better do this and just see what happens. And sent in a CD of some selections of my music, and that's basically how I met the director of Fell. Who heard something in it that was compatible with the screenplay that he was working on at the time.
And what was that process? We have had discussions about this in the past. It seems like you were doing some of the composition kind of in tandem with the production or the editing, and it was a sort of back and forth. What was that process, and what things made it into the film and what didn't? I think you told me that you do like little kind of sketch pad versions of music, and then you would do a proper version, and they would just go with the kind of the scribble version. Like, what was that process like with that film? What was that journey like? It is quite an excellent film. So if the audience hasn't seen it, the Fell, which premiered at the Sydney Film Festival, it's excellent work. What was that journey like?
Well, I just couldn't help myself when it came to writing music for the film. They didn't ask me not to get straight to work. So I did get straight to work, and I was on board in the early stages, before the shoot, early versions of the script, responding to that, sketching ideas, running through them with some friends, and just sending them off as ideas for consideration. And it's funny, but some of those really early ideas seem to stick, and I don't know what it was that made it that way, but I just found it impossible to improve on certain early ideas. You think as it goes along, you come up with more and more appropriate ideas that are more and more likely to replace old ideas, but they become embedded at a very early stage, and it's impossible to let go of them in as part of the story. So some very early sketches actually found their way into the film and have a more prominent place in it than I could possibly have expected at the time.
Does that actually change the filmmaking process, for the director? Does that actually change the film?
That's a question for a director, I suppose. I mean...
Have you asked?
No.
No,
I haven't
Do
asked.
you suspect that it changes the process? I mean, as James Curry says, sound is probably 60% of the film experience, so surely it would.
Well, I don't know if it changes the process, but it certainly contributes to the story, and in unexpected ways.
Changes the result.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, any contribution in any department of the production will. It's just a matter of whether or not it's something which is essential, and if it's not essential, then it has to go.
And do you think that and maybe it's hard to determine how it changes it, because sound is perhaps the most mysterious part of film. It's not as literal. It's not, the man is walking from here to here. It's it's an entirely different language.
I really envy the sound department. They get to do such musical work, and not in the and without the sort of staged associations of music with a capital M, as people listen to it, but just beautiful sounds arranged to tell a story on film. I'm bewildered and delighted by good sound design. It's just wonderful. I'd love my music to sound more like sound design.
Right. Now, the latest film that you've composed for is the Leunig Fragments.
Yes.
And Michael Leunig is quite in the news at the moment because of his sort of latest cartoon. What is your personal opinion of Michael Leunig, and do you think that latest cartoon was worth having a controversy about? Do you like his work? What's your personal opinion?
Everything's worth having a bit of controversy about. I don't know him personally. I didn't get to meet him during the making of the film, but I certainly respect free speech, and I think probably feel just as strongly about that as Lunik implies he does through his work. That's just so important, and if controversy is the result, so be it. That's fantastic. It's more important to have discussion about any topic than it is to be polite and sort of toe the line. That just bores the living daylights out of me when people do that. I'd much rather be offended than think something was sophisticated and appropriate and nice and witty and harmless.
Now, you have been nominated for an actor award for this for the score of this film. Congratulations. What was the process like for this film compared to Fell? Being a documentary, but the same director, what was it like?
Well, it's the main difference, and this wouldn't be the case for every documentary, but certainly in contrast to Fell, you just don't know what the story's going to be, and it was about a 5-year process. This shoot for this documentary, and any one of those fragments, and it's appropriately called the Leunig Fragments because there are just so many little pieces of the puzzle which have to come together to tell this story. I had no idea how they were going to come together in the end, and whether something might be picked up in a shoot next week that could change the direction of the whole film. Something of great significance might occur, which might put a previously solid musical idea in the wastepaper basket. So there are lots of fragmentary pieces of writing. It doesn't have a score that's sort of through composed and has motifs that really come back.
So, is there a level of almost blind faith when you don't know how the film is going to turn out, particularly with a documentary, that you're going to go, okay, this is my hunch, and I'm just going to do this. This is what I feel. Because your music is not you sitting at a keyboard and just churning out some ambient recordings. You're writing every note. A lot of people don't understand what a composer is anymore, because it's quite an old-fashioned job. But you're literally there with a pencil a lot of the time. Maybe some of it's done on a computer, but you're writing the music for someone else to play. And that's not you doing noodling and going, oh, that kind of ambient sound will work here. You're very specific. And so you can't be flippant about it. And therefore, when you're preempting a film with these compositions, is there a kind of, faith? Well, I hope this works.
I do noodle. I guess I've just got a way of noodling which involves more, HB pencils and paper than a lot of more well equipped and streamlined.
But because it's so laborious, the process, you can't noodle to the same extent. You can't noodle for have hours and hours of output, because just for the listeners, for instance, how long does it take you to compose, say, a 5-minute piece of music?
Oh gosh, I mean, it could be there's a bit of variation there, but if I could do 5 minutes in a week, I'd be pretty happy.
Yeah.
I guess what you might be referring to by by noodling and being careful with it is noodling with resources, because I'm really fond of working with musicians. I like to get collaborators on board and build up a team of performers and have a key recordist and half a dozen to a dozen musicians who I can call on regularly to sketch out ideas. And once you start using your budget to pay people, it's very easy just for it all to disappear unless there's a bit of discipline. So I had to be careful about sort of coming up with some kind of sketch for ideas that the team could have a listen to before I then went into the studio to get some feedback and just make sure that everyone was on board with it.
Yeah, and the other extreme to create that 5 minutes rather than a week could just be 5 minutes. Someone picking up a guitar and just kind of whacking.
Yeah,
for
and that
5
can
minutes.
work great.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. But it's just so interesting because you really are at the other end where it is very labour intensive.
Don't make it sound like it's not fun, because I love it.
but it is it's intense and very, to me it just seems really serious.
Yeah. It's I would always take it seriously. It's a feature film's a big project. You've got a lot of people counting on you. I'd never be flippant about it. You've got to have a sense of humour, but being flippant, that's not an option.
And how has the Leunig Fragments turned out, both as a film and incorporating your score?
Oh, I'm just thrilled with it. I went over to Sydney for the premiere this year, and although I'd seen most of the content of the film in various assemblies, it seemed so much different. I know it wasn't that much different, but it just came together in a way which seemed so complete for something which is made up of so many tiny pieces. And it could have been just a collection of tiny pieces, but it's not at all. It's got a beautiful arch to the story, and and the music, although that's, there are lots of very different musical ideas in there. The director and sound designer have pulled that together into something which, has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Although, as Goddard said, not necessarily in that order.
Your background is it's very interesting. Not the university part, that's boring as shit. But when you left university, you started a venue, an avant-garde music venue in Adelaide called Delicatessen.
Yes.
And you ran that for 4 years?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, so how the hell did you start that without a grant, for one thing? How did you maintain it, and what was that crazy journey like?
I was feeling pretty inspired at the time. I didn't go straight from university into that venture. I drifted off overseas, spent some time in Warsaw at the Warsaw Autumn Festival, which I'd been wanting to go to since forever. And after that, I went to the Netherlands and spent a bit of time in the Kraak scene, which is like underground squatters community. At the sort of the tail end of that, I guess it was a kind of a cultural era which doesn't exist in the same way now, with different rules and regulations about squatting in the Netherlands. But it was such a highlight of that culture just to be able to go down the street into some dusty underground little place that have their own little bar set up, and you'd be hearing musicians performing really wonderful, experimental, seditious, fun, violently interesting music, which I'd never heard anything like it. I mean, I'd just come from a festival of new music in Warsaw, and it was like I hadn't heard any new music before at all. This was completely different, with the likes of France de Waard operating and performing, an iconic underground musician. So when I came back to Adelaide, I thought, well, why isn't anyone doing this here? I'd love to do this. A friend of mine was running a gallery which he called Gallery Delicatessen on Anster Street in the city. I knew that he was about to move out, so I basically just found out who the landlord was and got on the phone and hassled him until I was assured of the lease, which was kind of like a verbal lease on this rundown building, which is now very posh.
Did you live there?
Yeah. Thanks for checking that. You asked how I could afford it, and I didn't have any grants or anything like that. Yes, I did live there. It was a 2-story building, 2 rooms. Downstairs was an empty space with some running water up the back, and upstairs was a little bit more running water and another big space. And I lived upstairs, and I had concerts on many nights downstairs and lots of great parties.
How regularly was this a music venue?
Well, it was how regularly. I mean, there was a lot of shows there. It was over 200 shows in 4 years. So that's 4 a week for 4 years. So pretty regularly. It was mostly in the evenings, because I was eventually had to get a job to pay the rent, and I'd get home from work, and often there would be musicians waiting at the door ready to set up for the concert that evening, and they'd bring drinks along, and then we could maybe only get about 35 people in their tops, but had a lot of exposure to really fascinating musicians who otherwise wouldn't have had a gig in Adelaide a lot of the time. There were people organising these gigs at Delicatessen. It wasn't just me. I threw open the doors to anyone who wanted to do the work, because I couldn't afford to pay anyone, but I could put the space up for free. So the likes of John Dale organised a great number of concerts by artists visiting from overseas. They might have been going to Melbourne or Sydney for a festival performance, and he'd know them through his work as a writer on music and a critic for The Wire and Dusted and other new music magazines. Invite them over to Adelaide. He'd go and pick them up from the airport. Him and his friends, who also had quite a lot to do with organising these events, and you'd bring out someone from Italy or France or the Netherlands to play one gig in Adelaide, and then they'd go home again, basically.
That's pretty special. So, although you didn't have government grants, it does sound like there was a little bit of philanthropy at times.
There was a lot of goodwill. Yeah, not a lot of money changed hands, that's for sure, but there was a lot of goodwill, and enough people who thought it was a worthwhile enterprise to keep it going and to keep trying to get people to come along, which is also an ongoing job in itself. Even though these international and visiting artists were really interesting, that doesn't mean that 30 people are going to turn up in Adelaide, because often they wouldn't. Sadly, a lot of the best gigs were witnessed by 6 or 7 people. That's how it works.
You and I met at my old video shop in Port Adelaide. Some good, interesting things have to end. Everything often has an end point. What happened to this project, and why did it end?
Well, it was pretty tiring. I mean, it was a full-time retail work to pay the rent, and then lots of concerts in the evening, and everyone, it was every night or every second night of the week for me, but for the person who was playing and the people who came along, it was party time. So it was often a really late night, and I got pretty tired, a little bit burnt out, and eventually it was just time to time to let someone else take over that side of things if they wanted to. No one took over that space, yes, that gave me a bit of room to do more of my own stuff. I found that I was doing a lot of great stuff with and for other people, but that I was ignoring a lot of the things that I wanted to do. And although it might be fun to still be doing it, I probably wouldn't be writing music for films if I was still there. Wouldn't have time.
I just want to come back to the life of a composer. It's very hard for me to understand because it's not really playing music. It's writing music, and you're not really attracted to playing. You're attracted to writing music and others playing your music. It's you in a very solitary task for much of that time. Why are you a composer? Why is that the path? Because for a lot of other people, particularly in a sort of modern era, I think they're far more attracted to playing and creating their own music with their own hands. But you want others playing your music. And as we've sort of established earlier, to compose a 5-minute piece may take a week or maybe even longer. It does seem very old-fashioned, and it does seem like you are clinging to something that a lot of other people are not clinging to. It's what you're doing is quite classical in a sense.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting because you're the only composer I've really ever met. And it's just, you are kind of holding on to a tradition and a process that does seem very old-fashioned. So it's just, and you're not a freak. You're not the kind of person that is antisocial or strange. But the idea of being a composer and locked away, writing down these notes and things does seem more secluded than, say, a projectionist or something.
It's a good test to get music into other people's hands. It just gives you a bit of feedback. If you're just going straight from your own ideas to a finished product without anybody in between, I think you're missing an opportunity to engage with other artists and to get their feedback, their advice, their comments and opinions, and take that on board to make better music. I find that a very valuable process. It's something I'd be reluctant to be without, even though it's a slow and expensive way of working. I find that for myself, I get better results if I'm listening to the ideas and opinions of other musicians and engaging with them as part of the composition process.
You have a really interesting friendship and relationship with Roberto.
Roberto Cavagnoli.
He's heavily featured in the Scott Hicks documentary Highly Strung.
Yes.
He makes instruments.
Yes.
In Italy, is following a sort of tradition, and now you're involved in selling these very special handmade instruments in Australia, and you have this, this wonderful friendship with this guy.
Yeah. We've got a lot in common, I guess. And talking to you today is making me consider that, and that sort of old-fashioned romantic notion of making violins by hand or composing music by hand. It's something, that we share. He makes violins the old-fashioned way. He comes from Cremona in Italy, which is sort of the home of the modern violin, and he has, learnt that tradition that's been handed down through the generations of just how to do it. It's slow, but also very rewarding. He can make maybe 4 violins a year if he works hard, 4 or 5, a cello and a viola, and it's obviously a fascinating enough process that it's featured in great detail in Scott Hicks' documentary Highly Strung that you mentioned. It's wonderful to watch. He's a fascinating personality and does great work. Yeah. It's one of the great treasures of my life, that friendship with Roberto.
And he comes and stays at your house.
He's a family friend.
You guys are like brothers.
We're very close. When I'm in Italy, I stay with his family, and on his frequent visits to Australia, he stays with me. We spend a lot of time together talking about music and violins, and film. We love watching film. We have a bit of a ritual of trying to watch at least one South Australian film every time that he visits. That's a lot of fun to show him.
And hence you have become one of the go-to guys in Australia for specialist musical instruments.
For nice violins, for sure. Yeah, certainly anyone who wants to have a look at the kind of work that's being done by hand in Cremona. I'm always happy to show people and talk about that. That's true.
Just a little bit of, I don't know if you call it inside baseball. Cass, director of the previous two films that you have composed, at the moment you're in a dialogue with him. I don't think you know what the next project is, but he's telling you of films to watch and to look at in terms of their music.
I'm not even sure it's in terms of their music, because the more films I watch that I'm, that I get asked to watch. I think maybe this isn't really about the music. Maybe this is just a great film. I'm not sure about whether it's the music or not. But with any director, I'm always asking, what is there that I can put on my to watch list. That's always good for a relationship between a composer and a director. So it's always looking for interesting ideas. Films to watch, and whether it's because the music's great or not, it doesn't really matter. If it's an interesting film, then great.
Do you think is there sometimes like a danger of taking it too literally? Like someone tells you that they like this movie and this score, and is there ever a risk of trying to sort of mimic something that already exists?
Yeah, that would be. Hopefully I wouldn't do that. Be so impetuous and naive. Although I have been known to be impetuous and naive, I think I wouldn't do that.
Is this like it is every time, or is it kind of like evolving? I mean, this is a long-term collaboration. What are you talking about? What are you discussing?
Well, I mean, I never take anything for granted. I mean, we've done a couple of feature films together, but he's emerged as an interesting director, and he could really work with whoever he wanted. So I don't have conversations with him with any assumption that I'm going to be composing his next film score, although of course I'd love to. So it's really just basic kind of film club, film buddy stuff. We share our thoughts about films that we've both watched, and those opinions just feed into a shared experience of filmmaking.
Do you think that cinema has similarities to music? Do you see it in similar terms?
Well, I guess there are a couple of ways of looking at it. I mean, music is an art form in its own right, but it's also a contribution to greater arts of storytelling like opera or film or theatre. So whether it's similar or not, I mean, anything can be musical in some respect, with whatever kind of analogies you want to use. Music can be almost seen as much as it can be heard, I think, in art and life. It's a way of experiencing life and an attitude to things, objects, people. It's music. I think it's the ability of someone who thinks about things musically. The advantages in that one is likely to listen more. I know I'm doing all the talking today, but I just love listening to things, listening to people and ideas, and whether I'm listening with my ears or my eyes, or any sense. Music is an attitude. I think a musical attitude is important to the things I find valuable in life. So whether it can be compared to cinema or not, yeah, sure. I mean, you can make comparisons between anything, but I think there are comparisons that could be made between music and anything else, not just cinema or the arts that employ music to help tell a story.
I think a lot of the great directors have always said cinema is much closer to music than it is theatre. And recently I've been watching the films of John McTiernan and Brian De Palma, and one way of describing their style is that it's symphonic. If it is like a symphony in terms of the sort of momentum, rhythm, and things playing together in harmony.
That's exactly what symphony means. Is things playing together, and especially in big action films, you tend to have everything going on at once in the same way you might have in a symphony. So I think that's a great way of describing it.
And gosh, and just hearing that, it kind of reminds me of how those big bombastic films do feel like an opera or something, particularly by the third act, where things smashing and big notes, and visually and orally all happening at once. So
It works well. It's a good comparison.
In fact, John McTiernan, the director of Die Hard, Predator, and Hunt for Red October, grew up in the opera. His father was blind. He also said that he watched a lot of foreign films and wouldn't watch the subtitles. He would keep his eye on the screen, and he would just be listening to the sound of how they say something, not what they're saying, but how they say something. And I think that's a key to sort of understanding cinema as performance rather than a literal script. Is not a book. And it's how you say something.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And there is a musicality in dialogue and performance and everything. And that, I think, one way as a director to look at actors, they are like an instrument, or they have an instrument. And I've really started to refer to things that way. There's an actor in the film I'm making at the moment. I sent him an email last night, and I said, I want you to look at two actors. I want you to look at Tom Cruise, and I want you to look at Pierce Brosnan, and just analyze their instrument, like analyze what they're doing with their instrument. That's what I said to him. and that's not me trying to be fancy. That's just shorthand to get an idea across. And I think that the more I learn and the more I understand cinema, the more I see it that way, that the actor has an instrument, and it's often the subtle use of that instrument that is most effective. It's less is more, because it's not theatre. It's not theatre.
It's not. And to take it a little bit further, it's easy to explain how actors can be typecast by thinking about musical instruments as well. Just as there's an instrument like an oboe, for example, is going to have a certain role to play in any traditional symphony. It's that very nasal, penetrating, but somehow still pastoral sort of tone that can, it's beautiful, but it sort of does its one thing. Whereas the more versatile instruments are a little more unpredictable and might be able to have more expressive range. Your string section, your piano, which is a kind of a world within itself.
Can an oboe play against type?
Of course, yeah, but it will be an oboe playing against type. Yeah, it will still be an oboe playing against type.
Yeah. So it's a bit like Arnold Schwarzenegger playing against type. He's still Arnold Schwarzenegger. You can't escape.
Yeah, and the novelty of it is that it's Arnold Schwarzenegger doing something which isn't, the big robotic bad guy.
Yeah.
Or good guy. The big, mean-looking buff dude.
Yeah.
You can do that with musical instruments too, but then it's comedy, which is great, taking something out of its usual context and putting it somewhere else. But there's no way to disguise it. It is what it is.
You started the conversation with 2001 and how it was the modern compositions in that film.
Yeah, modern 1960s, but still much more modern in terms of classical music than you often hear in film.
Yes.
Especially at the time that film was made.
So what are some of the film scores in contemporary cinema that you found really interesting or you've been inspired by?
Oh, it's going to be one of those, there are just so many that, where do you even
Really?
start? Well, there's almost always something valuable to take from any film score, whether it's a great one or not. There are going to be aspects of it that are worth paying attention to and learning from. I don't have a kind of a canon of great film scores.
We both saw a Joker together, and neither of us liked it. And the score...
I hope you're not going to ask me about the music because I can't remember
exactly.
anything.
Exactly. I was just about to say, I think that the score is not only totally forgettable, but when it was there and noticeable, it was often really pushy. There's a scene that would have benefited from having no score at all, but they had to tell you how to feel, and I thought that was a real dumbing down. And then a little later, when he's jumping down the steps in this scene that we're supposed to celebrate, they're playing the music of a fucking pedophile.
Yeah, look, it's not necessarily the composer's fault where the music, if something's done unsuccessfully, a composer can make their contribution, and it may or may not be taken up. It may or may not be a good idea. Something that they've composed for some other part of the film might end up being put somewhere that they'd never even considered, and that's all part of the way a film comes together. But you're right. I have trouble remembering the music from that film, except where I thought that that it would have been musical enough not to have capital M music in the foreground, where the music not only doesn't add anything by its presence, but clutters and impedes storytelling by some kind of sense of obligation to have some music in there. But why?
And how do you interpret the use of the Gary Glitter music?
I can't remember. You have to remind me.
He's I think it's called Rock and Roll Part 1 or Rock and Roll Part 2. It's that hey, rock and roll.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, he's a convicted pedophile. My understanding is he's in jail.
Yeah.
Why are they paying him money for that piece of music? Why is Hollywood paying this pedophile? And how do we interpret that as being in the movie? Is that supposed to give it another layer, or
if you interpret it as having any kind of social or political intent rather than it just being a famous tune, then yes, it's a statement. But
it can't escape the context. We know where it came from now. So, like, surely, unless you just don't know the backstory, it has that context. This is unescapable.
Yeah. Look, I mean, a lot of composers who are just really lovely people just write crap music, and a lot of assholes have written some really great music. I think it's never really. I mean, it's much less interesting to kind of whitewash music of its dubious characters. Music's got a lot of good and bad to offer, and it's one of, you've got to be able to listen to music as music outside of those contexts. I'm not saying ignore the background, the acts, the alleged acts, the ideologies, political or otherwise, of composers that either have done something terrible or are going to do something terrible or just don't really fit with the way you think. Still got to be able to hear their music and have a conversation about it. We were talking earlier about Leunig. I don't know him personally, but I respect freedom of speech, and you've got to be able to hear what people have to say, whether that's words or whether that's music, and make your own decisions about whether to agree with it or not, if agreement is even important. Someone like Gesualdo, going back to the classical canon, a murderer, but nonetheless, really did some important things in music, and you can't just say, well, let's ignore that history. Let's ignore his intuitive and baffling harmonies.
I wasn't saying necessarily ignore Gary Glitter. I'm just saying, what does it mean? When this is not someone from 500 years ago. This is a person who's currently in jail for sexually abusing minors, and they're using it in the most celebratory passage of the film, where people are, fist pumping for this sort of anti-hero.
I don't know. Look, I'm just I didn't know it was Gary Glitter. I didn't know. I was just, I went, oh, it's that tune. And it's a fist-pumping tune.
Because that score is so forgettable,
yes,
it's really interesting looking at a film that it's so obviously, derivative isn't the right word, it's a borderline remake. Taxi Driver, Bernard Herrmann's last film score, but before he died, now that is an unforgettable score. And I think it's just a really hard score to describe, particularly that main theme, the way that it comes in. It is just so is what it is, and there's nothing else quite like it for me. And I don't mean the kind of do, but the way it comes in with basically what feels like every instrument, every deep instrument at least playing all at once to create this kind of strange cacophony. It's just such an awesome piece of music. They're one of the greatest film scores ever. So unforgettable. And now we have Joker, which is sort of orally useless.
Yeah, of course. Bernard Herrmann had a really good music teacher from Adelaide, though, so that's another story. But what happens if you...
Wait a minute, what the fuck?
Oh, well, his I don't know if it was his only composition teacher, but he learned from Percy Grainger.
Right.
Yeah, an Adelaide composer. So what happens, we're talking about, you mentioned Gary Glitter before. What happens when you've got something that you really love, and then you find out, oh no, the person who made that is, they've done something reprehensible, what happens?
Case by case basis.
Because it's part of history, you know,
Yes.
whether you like it
Yeah.
or not. It's
Yeah.
it's part of history. Sometimes it's part of contemporary
Yeah.
history, but you really got to be able to deal with it, I think.
Well, I think it's a case by case basis, and look, I'd happily get all my Woody Allen DVDs and fucking smash them into small pieces. That's what I would do.
Okay, but have you? Or?
No, but I'm going to.
You're going
I'm going. To? No, it's just I haven't gotten round to it.
Yeah.
But no, I think that particularly in their own time. I think that I'll tell you one thing. Time does allow for more context of what's actually happened. Sometimes, and whether the work is worth keeping. But I've got to say, with pedophilia. And with
This is supposed to be a conversation
Well,
about music.
It was supposed. Well, you asked me.
No. You told me that Gary Glitter wrote the music for a section of the Joker. I had no idea it was him.
Sure.
And that's-
Yeah. But you just asked me what do we do, so I'm answering the question.
Yeah, sure.
I'm saying in the case of contemporary pedophilia, my judgment is that we leave these artists behind. That's my view. I mean, I'm not. That's my opinion.
Sure, yeah, that's fine. They're still a part of history. History is not pretty, you know. It's not full of just the nice people.
No, but do we allow them to continue to work? Like someone like Woody Allen is going to.
You can't stop someone from working. You can stop supporting them, but you can't stop them from working.
Well, that's what we're doing.
They'll go to jail. They'll still have a pencil and a piece of paper, or they'll be thrown into an asylum and they've got their crayons and they're still working. Like Wolfley,
Sure.
fantastic drawings. You know, a very distressed and disturbed individual, but the work is astonishing work.
Yes. Well, it's a complex area. I mean, there's a lot of debate about Michael Jackson, and I think that's something that's very much up in the air and debatable. Very much is debate. I don't think there is a clear answer on that because it's debatable as to what happened. I don't have a clear answer on that, but I can tell you that I'm unsure. But with someone like Woody Allen, it is supported to continue working, making a film a year, and it seems pretty conclusive that bad things were done. He married his stepdaughter. I mean, it is a.
Yeah, I mean, you're using contemporary examples primarily, and I'm using historical examples,
Yeah.
and perhaps that's a failing of my argument. I'm talking about Gesualdo and Wolfley, and you're talking about Woody Allen and Michael Jackson.
And that's why I'm saying to you that I think that the passage of time, it's like what they refer to as 20/20 hindsight. I think that the passage of time can reveal a bit more truth, and that's when we can sort of determine whether look, it's complex. I don't think there's easy answers here because you've got people from the classical period who are reprehensible, but they've defined classical music and maybe it is sort of complicated. Because you're an Adelaide guy, I just want to discuss Adelaide. Adelaide is really sort of interesting in that sometimes it's really surprising. It's where Rupert Murdoch comes from. It with the biggest media empire in the world.
Where Bernard Herrmann's music teacher comes from.
Yes, and yet we always kind of feel like nothing can be done here, and it's a little bit mediocre.
Who's we?
Adelaide. Come on, Adelaide conversations. Everyone dislikes Adelaide. Don't pretend. Don't say it's not lame. You told me that all the great Adelaide artists don't come from Adelaide. They come from regional South Australia.
Well, I don't think I said all, but I think there are, if you get around in art circles in Adelaide, you certainly find people from out of town, but still from South Australia.
Yeah.
But that's usual. I think there's a hub here. There are enough people to draw more people in, and especially if you're from a country town, it might be more likely that you need to go to the city to find more like-minded people. I don't know. I love Adelaide. I don't think it's lame at all. It's a great place.
I meant artistically lame. I think that Adelaide is...
I mean, I wouldn't be buggering around here if I didn't like it.
Okay, I'll put it a different way. I think Melbourne, okay, it's a larger critical mass, has a more interesting art scene. It is more sophisticated, but I wouldn't want to live there, and I wouldn't want to bring up my children there.
All right.
So to me, it's and Adelaide is probably an easier place to make a film. We just don't do it.
Yeah, we do. You do.
Yeah, but it's seldom. Like there's very few feature films made here.
Well, there are a few, and you know, maybe not every 5 minutes, but there are a number of really good South Australian films. I mean, if we're going to say that there's not much coming out of Adelaide, then we've got to say there's not much coming out of Australia, because a pretty, you know, disproportionately high percentage of better Australian films come from Adelaide.
What are the ones in the last 5 years?
The last 5 years, The Infinite Man comes to mind as a personal favourite.
That might even be...
It's exactly 5 years.
Okay, anything since then?
You can edit this silence to be as long as you like.
Yeah. So I think that whereas compared to Melbourne, let's separate the mainstream stuff. They have more of an underground scene where people are making low budget, zero budget feature films in Melbourne.
Yeah.
Where people, okay, these films are going to be a bit rough around the edges, but they do have 100%. Creative freedom, and that's what's really interesting, I think, about some of the interstate places, that they have an underground filmmaking scene, whereas I feel Adelaide doesn't.
Okay.
And I would say that the good films that were made in Adelaide, like Snowtown, I mean, that's what, it's like 10 years ago or something.
Yeah.
Or Boxing Day by Creve standards, again, it's like
Yeah.
like 10 years ago. And even I think some of the seed investment in Emil Courtney Wilson's first narrative feature, Hail,
Yep.
came from Adelaide. Like, yes, the potential is here, but I would say it's a little dormant right now. However, we're making Mortal Kombat here, which is
It's bizarre,
like
isn't it?
like a potentially a big blockbuster. So it's a rebooting of a popular Hollywood movie series. So like, who knows? It is kind of interesting, but I don't think we have the underground scene here. I don't think that it's encouraged. In fact, I think in some ways it's overtly discouraged. So and I don't think Melbourne has quite that issue, because there are alternative screening venues there. You know, there are like several, and there are sort of alternative cinema groups. We don't have that here. Just 1 second. My door's swung open.
Ah.
You know, my optimum time is really like 2 in the morning.
Right. Yeah, sorry I couldn't make that work for you.
No, that's all right.
I have to go to Europe to be interviewed at a reasonable hour by my rota.
Yeah, that's a funny way of looking at it. Luke, thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate your work on my films. You were a consultant, a musical consultant on Youth on the March, and we wouldn't have our theme from Purcell if you didn't show me, via your record collection and things like that.
Sure.
I don't know much about music. I don't. You're my go-to guy, and I appreciate it, and I really appreciate the chat.
Oh, thanks. That was great fun. Thanks, Mike.
Do you like punching? Do you like kicking? Do you like man grabbing? Do you like casual racism? Then you're gonna love Pride Resurrection. It's the best pride fighting championship show on the internet. It might be the only pride fighting championship show on the internet, but you'll love it. It's guaranteed. And if you don't love it, well, you can go fuck yourself. It's Pride Resurrection. We got them all. We got Don Fry. We got Gary Goodridge. We got Kazushi Sakuraba and a whole bunch of other Japs that you can watch fighting each other. Just remember, when you're bored and you need something to watch, Pride Resurrection, go watch it, you fucking jerk.